What happened to the lost tribes of Israel? If you've been following this series, you'll know that the northern Israelites were conquered and deported by the Assyrians just before 700 BC. From there, they've been mostly lost to official history. But did they just drop off the face of the earth? Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries. In previous videos, we've been looking at various groups of people in different parts of the world who are not Jews, but who claim Israelite ancestry from these so-called lost tribes, the B'nai Israel of Central Asia and Western India, the B'nai Menashe of Eastern India, and the so-called Kaifeng Jews, as well as the Falasha of Ethiopia. Now in this video, we're going to take a look at a ridiculed, but I believe very intriguing possibility, something I call European Israelism. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, some writers in Great Britain termed the theory British Israelism, but the scope of the theory is actually wider than just Britain. Okay, let me summarize the theory. The northern tribes of Israel were taken captive by the Assyrian Empire beginning around 740 BC and ending with a mass deportation after 722 BC. They were resettled in the area where northern Syria meets Turkey and Iraq. Others were resettled in cities of Media, which would be hundreds of miles further east in northern Iran. That much is pretty clear. It's what the Bible records. It's what most everybody agrees on as a starting point. But this European Israelite theory goes on to argue that those tribes didn't stay put for very long, but migrated both west into what is now Turkey and north into southern Russia, as well as east into Central Asia. Now remember, we're not talking about a few hundred people who could just blend in with other people that they encountered. No, the Jewish historian Josephus wrote about them in the 1st century AD, more than 800 years after their deportation. And he describes the exiled Israelite tribes in his own time as an immense multitude. So it makes sense that these people moved on en masse seeking new homelands. You might want to watch the second video in this series, which shows that the Israelites of Bukhara almost certainly represent some of these people. But here's where it gets a bit tricky. Those arguing for this theory say that at least some of these Israelites came to be associated with ancient Central Asian tribes such as the Cimmerians and Scythians. Well, how could that be? Well, let's take a look at some of the names of these groups of people. The Cimmerians seem to pop up as a group about the same time as the Israelite deportations, the late 700s and early 600s BC, and in the same general area as the deported Israelites may have gone. But if they're the same people, why wouldn't they just be called Israelites? There's very little in ancient records that mentions Israelites at that time and place. And actually, turns out it really isn't very surprising at all, because the Assyrians who conquered and deported them didn't call them Israelites. Instead, they called them Qumri. Wasn't that kind of strange? Not really. Nations often go by several names. We Americans sometimes get called Yanks. Brits get called Limeys, etc. So the name that the northern tribes were known by from the Assyrian perspective was Beit Omri, or House of Omri. Omri was one of the more significant kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. In fact, Omri was the father of the infamous King Ahab. In one northern Israelite dialect, Beit Omri was pronounced Beit Humri. Now keep in mind that the Assyrians didn't speak Hebrew. They found it hard to pronounce Beit Omri or Beit Humri. Their best effort seems to have been Beit Qumri, or just Qumri. And their records do mention those people. In their very extensive writings, the Assyrians recorded their interactions with the Qumri. Then, 100 years later, the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians and took over their empire. Once again, language alters pronunciation. Babylonian records calls the Qumri Gimri. The Greeks also mention these same people in their historical documents, calling them Cimmerioi, or Cimmerians. There are other theories about the origins of the Cimmerians, but it's generally agreed that they originated in Western Asia and southern Russia in the final centuries of the BC era. Okay, how about the Scythians? Well, remember those Israelites who were deported to the cities of the Medes in northern Iran? About that same time, a people called the Sake appear in Persian records. They seem to have moved through Persia into the area east of the Caspian Sea. In Persian, the term Sake seems to mean wanderers. The Greeks listed those nomadic Sake people in their histories as Scythoi. Their annals record them as originating in Central Asia and then moving west into southern Russia and the Ukraine. The Romans picked up the records of the Greeks and called them Scythians. But were they Israelites? It's hard to say. but it's at least possible that there were Israelite elements among the people groups known as the Cimmerians and Scythians. Since both the Cimmerians and Scythians were nomadic people, they left very few records, so we know relatively little about them. What we do know is that many people groups were moving around in the centuries leading up to the birth of Christ. The Cimmerians seem to have moved west through Turkey, where they left some people behind known as the Galatians. And then they migrated up through the Balkans and settled in Central and Western Europe. Other Cimmerian groups traveled north through the Caucasus Mountains and settled in southern Russia. When they arrived in these regions, the Greeks called these Cimmerian migrants Keltoi or Celts. The Romans called them Cimbri, Gauls, or Galatai. The Scythians migrated west a bit later and settled more in northern and central Europe. After their arrival in Europe, the Romans called them Teutons or Germani. One subgroup of Scythians was the Migrated. When they arrived in the west, they called themselves Gates or Goths. In their migrations, these people brought down the Roman Empire in the west. The Cimmerians and Scythians settled in Germany, Britain, Spain, and parts of France, as well as other places in Europe. Today, they form a significant portion of the European DNA. So if the theory is true that the Cimmerians are the Celts and the Scythians are the Germanic peoples, and that at least part of their descent was from displaced Israelites, there is a glaring problem. When these people arrived in Europe, they were no longer identifiable as Israelites. They didn't speak Hebrew, but instead spoke Celtic and Germanic languages, unrelated to Hebrew. Their customs also bore little resemblance to people who came from the Middle East, and their genetic characteristics were different from those of Middle Eastern people. So doesn't that blow the European Israelite theory out of the water? Maybe. However, one possible explanation could be that several hundred years of wandering would naturally cause huge changes in any population unless they cling stubbornly to their bloodlines and heritage. My guess is that if the theory has any truth to it, somewhere along the line some displaced Israelites merged with other non-Israelite people in the regions through which they traveled. As an example, just look at the North American continent. So many different groups have come here and intermingled with each other. Now there are new and distinctly different cultural and linguistic identities, American, Canadian, Mexican, etc. And even within these broad identities, there are numerous subgroups, blends of what came here and merged together. The more traditional theory for the Cimmerians is that they descended from Gomer, son of Japhet, and grandson of Noah. These people wouldn't be at all closely related to the Israelites, who are descended from Shem, another of Noah's sons. But it could be that some of these displaced Israelites merged with the descendants of Gomer. They picked up their languages and customs, intermarried with their people, and became something neither of the groups were before, Celts and Germans. My own ethnic background is a great example. I'm a blend of many nationalities who came to North America: Germans, English, Welsh, Scots and Scots-Irish, even a bit of Dutch and French Huguenot. I speak none of these languages, only English, and American English at that, although I have learned Spanish through my travels in Latin America. So I am something new and different from my European ancestors. The writers who promoted British Israelism at the turn of the 20th century claimed that the purest line of these Israelites settled in Britain as the Anglo-Saxons. That's quite a claim, since in my opinion you have to make a lot of very shaky links to arrive at that conclusion. But scholars do agree that the tribes that we know as Angles and Saxons had moved around quite a bit before they ended up on the North German and Danish coasts, from whence they invaded Britain in the 5th century AD. Also, a quick search of the roots and origins of Celtic and Germanic tribes in general yields very little that would necessarily outright disprove the theory of an Israelite connection with some of the European peoples. All right, but before we go, here's a fascinating fact. There are a couple of tiny bits of linguistic evidence of a probable Hebrew link with the Germanic peoples. For instance, ancient forms of Germanic languages like German, Dutch, English, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, had an aspect of their linguistic structure that was similar to Hebrew. Even today, English retains the ancient internal verb changes from present to past tense, like Hebrew. For example, see, saw, go, went, wind, wound, catch, caught, think, thought. Where did that come from? As far as similarities between Hebrew and the Celtic languages like Gaelic and Welsh, There are significant numbers of words that are very much alike in both vocabularies, as well as some similar sentence structures between the Celtic languages and Hebrew. Now, none of this is in dispute, but how do you account for it? Many of those who study these things theorize that Hebrew or Phoenician traders may have traveled to Europe and influenced the languages of the ancient Celts and Germans, which of course is possible. Trading between the Mediterranean and the northern coast of Europe did happen in ancient times. The fact that Irish legend has some of the kings of Ireland married to Israelite princesses may be memories of these trading and diplomatic ties. But on the other hand, the presence of large groups of Hebrew speakers living among tribal groups as they migrated west would also explain these similarities. It's certainly not proof, but it's an intriguing possibility nonetheless. Okay, enough for now. See you in the next video when we'll talk about the Khazar connection. This is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries. See you then.